你好，我是史东。在今天节目中呢，我们为您访问的是一个非常有名的美国籍的作家，他所写的书呢有很多，甚至说可以说是全部，和中国和中美关系有关。那么其中他有一本书呢，也曾经被这个好莱坞拍成电影，他的名字叫做 James Bradley。在今天节目中呢，我为您介绍的这本书叫做 The China Mirage。China Mirage 中文怎么翻的？这本书的中国版呢，他把它翻译成中国幻象，我把它翻译成美国的中国蜃楼。蜃楼就是海市蜃楼的蜃楼。主要他在这本书里面讲的是中国和美国之间的关系的缘起，以及经过这么多年以来到今天美国和中国的关系呢，他回头看看有很多的误读，就是错误的解读。那么因此呢，他说在美国呢，他所观察的现象呢，他对美国呢，对中国有很多的一厢情愿式的这种看法，这是他希望能够指出来的。这本书呢，内容非常的丰富，在我们今天大概60分钟左右的节目时间里面呢，不可能全部的 cover， 但是我希望能够有一种这个叫做抛砖引玉的效果。我希望各位能够注意这本书。我们今天非常非常高兴能够有机会呢，请在越南在西贡接受我们访问的 James Bradley。现在呢，我们就把 James Bradley 带进我们的画面之中。Welcome, James. Welcome to my show.
Good to be here.
Why you want to write this book? What prompts you to write this book?
It's a lifelong story. I was born in Wisconsin. Uh-huh. My dad fought on Iwo Jima. I went to school in Japan. When I was 20 years old, I hitchhiked around the world. China was closed, but I hitchhiked around the girth of the globe. I was in 21 countries by the time I was 21. Later, when my father died, we found a box of secret papers. I wrote Flags of Our Fathers, which became a New York Times #1 bestseller. Many people have seen the Steven Spielberg, Clint Eastwood movie, Flags of Our Fathers. I wrote a book, Flyboys, about George Herbert Walker Bush being shot down in Japan. And then I thought, how did all this happen out in the Pacific, all these wars? I went back to Teddy Roosevelt, wrote my third book, The Imperial Cruise, that shows how he set us in motion into the Pacific. And then with my last book, The China Mirage, the book we're talking about today, I showed how Franklin Delano Roosevelt dealt with Japan and China, and it eventually led to war.
What really interests me is because there's a lot of stuff you talk in the book as a Chinese, regardless if the Chinese is educated from the PRC side or on the ROC side. There's a lot of things you talk about in the book that we don't know about. That is really, really something.
It's hidden history. I mean, I didn't know either until I stumbled upon a bunch of this stuff.
What was the reaction you received from your Chinese audience? Because you have a Chinese version out already.
Yeah, I don't really know the reaction, and I don't pay a lot of attention. I'm always on my next project. But the China Mirage is translated in Beijing and also Taipei.
Uh-huh. So I was just wondering, there's no reaction, or you don't pay a lot of attention to the reaction that.
Well, I get emails. I've done book tours. Sold a lot of that book. It's a real eye opener, and I get long emails from Chinese readers. So yeah, there's been a great reaction, but I'm not counting the numbers day to day.
Let's just delve into it. What would you say you wish to have a takeaway for people who read this book?
The China Mirage is about how America does not know China, but it projects an understanding of China in a way that we think we know. I mean, think about, to the listeners here in the United States, think about your foreign vacations. Where have they been? Paris, Rome? How about Beijing or, Shanghai? Uncle Joe went to China on a 2-week cruise, but in terms of, relationships, there's very little intermingling between America and China historically. I mean, for years, it was illegal to deal with the Chinese. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act. They couldn't even come into the country. Nobody wanted to let me put it this way. In the biggest selling book about China in the 1930s, number one for 2 years in a row was Pearl Buck's The Good Earth. And Americans fell in love with it because it was a Thomas Jeffersonian tale that superimposed American emotions onto the Chinese. Well, we love those Chinese so much in that book, but when we went to make the movie, Chinese couldn't play the part. It was illegal to have a Chinese person on screen. So for a Chinese person to be kissing and touching another person. There were no Chinese no Chinese people in the Chinese movie, The Good Earth. So we don't know China, but we're imagining that we do. And Americans are imagining that those Chinese are going to change. They're going to become more like us. What they really want is democracy. But they've got those commies sitting on top of them. Or they've got an emperor, a corrupt emperor. Somehow the leadership of China is corrupt. And if the Chinese people were freed, they'd want to become just like us, having potluck dinners in whitewashed churches. Americans are not seeing that this is a totally different civilization. And we have a missionary attitude where we're telling them what to do rather than learning from the ancient Chinese culture.
How much of that has changed?
Very little. Uh-huh. Very little. The trade negotiations right now, I mean, the press, I don't know where the reader's getting their information about what's going on between China and America, but this trade war negotiation stuff, there's very little truth in it. What the truth is that America wants to get under the hood of the Chinese car and station observers in China to observe American ways to insert American ideas into the Chinese culture, and it's ridiculous. And China is saying no. This is not about soybeans. It's about America wanting China to become more like America. It's the China Mirage, and it's been going on since George Washington.
Where do you think this trade war negotiation is going to go?
Nowhere good. I think that America cannot stand to see China become the number one country in the world, even though China has a peaceful rise. We're just not going to stand it, and we would rather throw sand in the gears. So Huawei 5G, I'm from Wisconsin. Huawei 5G would be especially helpful to rural communities all across the country. It could help change their lives. But we would rather not have these rural communities hooked up to the future than have China ride. And I don't get it. There's 4 times as many people in China, and they could have an economy 4 times as big as the United States. What's the problem?
Let's not talk about what this is going to do to China. Let's talk about what this is going to do to the United States. What do you think the outcome is going to be?
A slower growth. Like I say, by throwing sand in the gears of the rise of China, the world is going to slow. The world economically is going to slow. Advantages that could accrue to all world citizens are going to slow. Let's put it this way. In 1959 with Russia's Sputnik, America said, hey, we've got to be number one. Let's invest in engineering and science and let's compete. Now America's saying, let's not compete. Let's throw sand in the gears.
Let's go back to this book. How much time did you spend in preparation for that?
Well, all my life, maybe. I went to school in Japan. I went to school in Japan when I was 19, and I didn't read it, but I read a lot all my life. And I had read about China. After I finished 3 books, my next book naturally should be about China. And I traveled a tremendous amount all over China doing interviews. And I was in Taiwan with my daughter who lives in Taipei. And it's funny. It was like magnetically, I was in between the United States and China. And I realized that almost everything I had been taught about China growing up and everything that I was currently reading in the United States was a mirage. just was not true if I went to China and checked it out. And I did a little more research, and I write a book, China Mirage, where I show that something is happening in China, and it's interpreted completely differently back in the United States. Chiang Kai-shek, 1930s, a real monster of a brutal dictator arises, but American Time magazine has him holding a Bible. And in the back, there's a statue of Jesus. So he's a nice guy, and we should support him, because if you support this guy with the Bible, China's going to become Christian. And maybe that sounds silly, like I'm simplifying it, but it's not. I document in the book where the American media propagandize the future Christianization of China if we just support this Chiang Kai-shek. And then a guy in pajamas, Mao, came and ruined it, and we didn't talk to China for a generation.
I think you've written in the book that Mao really wanted to establish some kind of a friendship or relationship with the United States in the beginning. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I was astounded. I grew up learning, one piece of propaganda from the American government and media, and that is Mao hated China. There's this guy who just had this unreasonable hatred of America. And it's not true. As I document in the book, in 1945, Mao is reaching out to President Roosevelt. He wants to come to the White House. Mao's never been on an airplane, but he's writing a note saying that he wants to come to the White House to explain to Roosevelt that Chiang Kai-shek is not China's future, that Mao is going to be the next emperor, let's say, of China. And Mao did not want Russian borscht. He wanted Wall Street money. Mao was pitching the United States saying, the future of the world is Chinese labor and American capital. Look, that's what just happened in the last 30 years. Everybody thinks that's a recent phenomenon. That's what Mao was pitching to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but American officials cut the communication, and Mao never went to the White House.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's talk about the beginning of the U.S.-China relationship, as stated in your book. How did it get started? And I want to eventually get into the opium trade. Please help us with that.
Well, let's start with opium. I mean, look at where China is. Look where America is. There's a lot of water in between there. So, of course, it was shipping and the Navy that first encountered China. And there were two nations that had a large number of civilian ships and also a Navy, and that was Britain and the United States.
I'm sorry, this is in the beginning of the, what 1800s?
Yeah,
okay.
1800.
Okay.
So, you've got the biggest, richest country on earth, China. See, we're looking at China as this poor third world country that just recently rose. No, Chinese were walking around in silks, reading published books with paper money in their pocket, while the Parisians were scratching garlic and potatoes out of the earth. So China was this advanced, rich civilization. And England puts the Industrial Revolution on top of a ship and comes and bombards their way into China to do what? To sell opium. What was opium? Opium was the #1 biggest commodity sale of the 19th century. Think of wheat, rice. Oil wasn't big yet, but think of huge commodities like rice or wheat. Oh my God, opium was more compact and more profitable. More money in opium than in any other food. So the English bring opium in. The emperor says, no, it's illegal. But the British have the water assets, have the naval assets to pockmark the coastline of China and shove opium in. And guess who the #2 players were? It was the Americans. At one example, there's a guy named Warren Delano. Warren Delano was the grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Warren Delano was the American opium king of China. He brought opium money back and lived in a mansion enough to support his grandson as president, who never had to work. Go to Yale Everyone knows the Skull and Bones Society on the Yale campus. The Bushes were members, so many of America's powerful. Who pays for that Skull and Bones crypt, I guess they call it, on Yale campus? It's funded by the opium company that Warren Delano worked for. Princeton University's first big benefactor, that was opium money. The college, the number one building on the Columbia University campus is Low Library. That's an opium dealer who worked with Warren Delano. So opium money was extremely profitable. It built the first railroads in the United States. The money did. And, drug dealing. Just think of cocaine and marijuana now, the huge suitcases of profitable money. So America was number two in the number one commodity trade of the 19th century.
That is what I was referring to. Most of the Chinese didn't know about this. They know about the British. They know about the Opium War. But I would bet very, very few Chinese people know about this. Why do you think that is?
I'm not sure. I mean, they were number two, but of course, the Americans couldn't initiate it and couldn't start it because the British had the naval assets. And, even when Americans would go to China, like Admiral Perry, who opened up Japan, he sailed out of Washington, D.C. with his naval armada. Well, he had to go the British route. He couldn't go across the Pacific. He had to go to England, and then he had to go around South Africa to Cape Town and India and Singapore. So we were very dependent on the British who were out there before the Americans. So I'm not saying the Americans were as big as the British. That's kind of hard. You'll see in the book that Queen Victoria, 25% of the kingdom's income was opium dealing. They were making a lot of money.
So let's talk about the trade war. What would you say is the top three misconceptions the U.S. has toward Chinese?
Top three. I think by far the number one is the China Mirage, that the Chinese are going to change, and they need to change. We have a superior system. It's democracy. And we're missionaries with a superior religion, superior background. And even though we know very little about China and the Chinese, we know enough that they had better change, and they had better become more democratized. And then we make it up that, those people, most of the Chinese would love to be democratic, but it's those rulers they have on top of them. So if we could just scrape them off, the Chinese people are going to rise up and demand democracy. That's a mirage. That is just wild thinking. Let me give some background to the lack of connectivity. See, some of our listeners are thinking, China, Romania, Italy, England. I know a lot of different countries. No, we're talking about the biggest thing in humanity. We're talking about, historically, the richest, most dominant economy in the history of the world. We're talking about the oldest, biggest civilization in the world. There's only one, and this is China. America in the 1880s enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act. Chinese couldn't come to the United States. Then vigilantes all across the West cleaned the Chinese out. See, if you go to a Clint Eastwood or John Wayne movie and they depict the real West, you'd see a Chinese store and a Chinese hotel and a Chinese stagecoach. The Chinese, after they built the railroad, were out, and they were extremely successful entrepreneurs running a lot of the West until vigilantes just cleaned them out. Now, folks, we're a country that for 100 years or so, it was illegal for a Chinese to come into the country. See, I thought after Mao, in the 1950s, I thought China was closed. It wasn't. China was open to the world. Americans couldn't go there. 0 reporters went to China in the 1950s. 0. One got through. He he didn't sneak into China. China allowed him in, but he evaded American controls. He went to Beijing. He reported on what was happening in China. He came back to the United States, and President Eisenhower took his passport away. The amount of complete non-information that we've had about China is stunning. You've got the 2 biggest countries in the world on either side of the Pacific, and Americans are dreaming about China but don't know China. This is not a criticism. This is coming from an American wishing that we would build better bridges of communication with China.
Let's turn the table around. What do you see as the most common misconception from Chinese standpoint towards U.S.?
I don't know. I'm not Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
But in my way of looking at it, I'm over here in Asia, and like I'm right next to Laos. 40% of the country is so full of American bombs that you can't walk there. There's little paths through the countryside of Laos that have been demined and you can walk. You step out that path, you might be blown up. Those aren't Chinese bombs. Those are American bombs. I'm in Vietnam, where an estimated 3 million people, maybe it's 2 million, maybe it was 3 million, a lot of people. I'm supporting Agent Orange and napalm children here. That didn't happen from China. The South China Sea, China does not have a record of aggression there. It was from the South China Sea that John McCain flew his airplane to bomb Hanoi. So, in terms of world peace, America's all the way out here, and China is not off the east coast of New York. China isn't lurking underneath the San Francisco Golden Gate. So I think it's more important, the American attitude towards China, because there's been a lot of violence out here in Asia because of that attitude.
I was asking how did the Chinese react to your book? I think the more important question is how did the American react to your book?
I don't exactly know. I write books and they sell and then I go on to the next book. I wrote
because
Flags
here's
of Our
why
Fathers.
I say that, James.
Go ahead.
Is yours type of book is not just novel or things that people can read and forget and put it aside. In my opinion, yours is the type of book that people keep. They should put in their library and then remind them about what you are talking about or what you're trying to tell them. In this particular case, is the China Mirage. So it's more of a long-lasting impact type of book. This is my opinion. That's why I asked the question.
Well, thank you. I get a lot of comments saying this should be taught in schools. This has to be in our libraries. And fine, put it in the schools or put it in the libraries.
That wouldn't be bad.
The information in the China Mirage was a shock to me too. Again, my inspiration was that after going back and forth to China for a few years, I just realized, oh my God, the story is that I'm an educated American with a history degree, and I got fed a load of baloney, a mirage about China. And it's time that we take that veil off.
When did you first realize there was a mirage?
Well, like I say, I wrote 3 books about Asia.
Yeah.
I got a degree in history. I thought I knew a little about China, but I had never been there. I started going in 2002, and somewhere around, I'd have to think it out, but like 2008 or 10, yeah, I was traveling all over China, north to south, sleeping in caves. I mean, I had 5 interpreters at one point, interviewing veterans and, poking around and looking for a book. And then all of a sudden, I just realized that there was a dynamic where almost everything that I had absorbed from the American side about China was a mirage. It wasn't accurate.
Wow.
And I showed that in the book. Time magazine in the 1930s is saying, here's a Christian guy America should support. And he had, prisoners and dungeons underneath his feet. But he had learned that if you pose with an American Bible and if you have missionaries around you, that America will support this mirage that China wants to become Americanized. China wants to become Christianized.
It's just a very, very successful PR job somebody was doing on behalf of Chiang Kai-shek's government, or he hired somebody to do that.
Well, no, you see in the book that there was the Song family should I tell the whole song story?
Yeah, sure.
So this is the root of the propaganda supporting Chiang Kai-shek and the money. So Charlie Song is the first Chinese baptized on the East Coast. American missionaries send Charlie Song back to Shanghai to be a missionary. And Charlie Song's a smart kid. He says, this isn't going to work. The Chinese don't want to become Christian, but the missionaries will spend a lot of money on their Mirage. So he opens a Bible company. And he says to the missionaries, instead of shipping heavy Bibles over, I'll print them right here. And he gets an agreement from the American Bible Society. He becomes a multimillionaire, has 3 children. He sends them to school in the United States. And this is very rare. Chinese in going to school in America. And they see something. They see the China Mirage. They see that their compatriots at Harvard and these other schools know zip about China. They've never been to China. They've never met a Chinese. But they're projecting this mirage. The one thing they know about China is that China wants to become Christian. So these 3 kids go back and they surround the dictator Chiang Kai-shek and they support him financially. And they say, we need to propagandize to the Americans, get that Bible there and get that Jesus statue in the back and start talking about Jesus. And all of a sudden you have this murderous tyrant, Chiang Kai-shek, writing stories for Time magazine, Why I Love Jesus. And I'm not kidding you. And then Pearl Buck writes a book about a China that Americans love. Pearl Buck was a missionary's daughter. Pearl Buck writes a book where the Chinese love American values. She doesn't say it exactly that way, but reading the commentators at the time, a few of them said, if you put Pearl Buck's book about China in the heartland of Iowa, it would have the same storyline. These were American values that she was projecting on the Chinese. So anyway, Chiang Kai-shek is going to be this Christian salvation. America gives him more money than we spent on the atomic bomb. And then we're shocked when Mao arises. What happened? We had 20 years of propaganda from Franklin Roosevelt and Time magazine and the New York Times and the Washington Post that China was just about to become Christian. And then this commie in pajamas, Mao Zedong, he takes over. Well, you know what? There must have been some criminal action in the State Department. We're not wrong with our China Mirage. Joe McCarthy rises up and says, China would have been Christian, but State Department bad people kneecap the whole plan. And that begins McCarthyism. McCarthyism is not rooted in anti-Soviet feeling. It's rooted in this China Mirage that Americans could.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. When Joe McCarthy stood up with his original documents and gave his first speech in West Virginia, Wheeling, West Virginia, he only named one turncoat, and that was John Service of the State Department. And what was John Service's crime? He met with Mao. John Service could speak Chinese, like 4 dialects. He meets with Mao. He goes back to Washington and says, hey, Washington, Chiang Kai-shek's yesterday. The Chinese people don't want him. They're going to go with Mao. Oh, my God. McCarthy has him fired. Every single person from the State Department who knew Mao, who could speak Chinese, got fired. In the 1950s, in the State Department, in the Russian department, you had to speak Russian to get into the Russian department. In the Chinese department, if you spoke Chinese, you got fired. It's true. I documented in the book.